He smiled when the judge signed the papers. Not politely, not with relief, with victory. My husband leaned back in his chair like he had just closed the most profitable deal of his life. His lawyer slid the final document across the polished table toward me, the faint scent of expensive cologne drifting through the room. "Everything looks finalized," the lawyer said. I looked down at the page. The house, the cars, the vacation property, the investment accounts. Every visible asset we had built over 15 years of marriage now sat neatly under Ethan Cole's name. My soon-to-be ex-husband tapped the paper with his pen. "You're sure you're okay with this, Claire?" he asked. His tone was soft, patient, almost generous, like a man offering mercy. I signed my name. The pen moved smoothly across the paper. "I'm sure." He studied my face, waiting for anger, for tears, for regret. I gave him none. That seemed to confuse him. But that wasn't the part that shocked me. The shocking part came about 6 minutes later when Ethan gathered the documents, stood up, and said something he would repeat proudly for months afterward. "Well," he said, sliding the folder into his leather briefcase, "I guess I took everything." I looked at him. And at the time, I stayed quiet. Because Ethan had no idea what he had just taken. People always assume divorces explode. Screaming, thrown glasses. Doors slammed hard enough to shake the walls. Our divorce didn't look like that. It looked calm, civilized, efficient. Which was exactly how Ethan liked things. Efficiency was his favorite word. Efficiency in business. Efficiency in relationships. Efficiency in removing anything that slowed him down. The truth is, our marriage had started dying long before the paperwork. I think the first crack appeared about 5 years earlier. We were standing in the kitchen of our house in Brookhaven, white marble counters, huge windows overlooking the lake, when Ethan casually announced something that would eventually change everything. "I'm moving Julia onto the leadership team," he said. Julia worked at the tech company we had built together. Or at least, that's what the outside world believed. In reality, Ethan had slowly begun referring to it as his company. "Leadership team?" I asked. He shrugged. "She's been doing good work." Julia had been working there 6 months. She was 26, brilliant with presentations, less brilliant with boundaries. I leaned against the counter. "And what exactly will she be leading?" Ethan poured himself coffee. "Strategic development." "That's what I do." He looked at me like I had just said something mildly inconvenient. "Not exclusively." At the time, I didn't argue. That confused him. Ethan expected conflict. Conflict gave him something to dominate. Instead, I nodded slowly. "Okay." And that was the moment something shifted. Not between us. Inside me. Because I started watching. Really watching. When you stop defending yourself in a relationship, you begin to see things very clearly. And what I saw over the next 2 years was fascinating. Julia started appearing in conversations more often. She's very sharp. She has great instincts. She understands the future of the company. Meanwhile, my role slowly changed. Ethan didn't announce it. He simply adjusted things. Board meetings I used to attend alone became meetings he handled with Julia. Investor dinners I once hosted became events where Ethan sat beside her while I listened quietly. One night after a particularly long meeting, Ethan tossed his jacket over a chair and said something that stayed with me. "You're great with operations, Claire." I looked up from my laptop. "Operations?" "Yeah," he said casually. "The behind-the-scenes stuff." The company had started in our garage. Together. I built the financial model. I negotiated our first investor. But now I was behind the scenes. At the time, I didn't react. That confused him. The first person who noticed the change wasn't Ethan. It was Marcus. Marcus had been our company's CFO since year 2. He was quiet, analytical, and impossible to fool. One evening, he knocked gently on my office door. "You have a minute?" "Of course." He closed the door behind him and sat down across from me. "Something's shifting," he said. I noticed. Marcus studied my face. "You're calmer than I expected." I smiled faintly. "I'm learning." "Learning what?" "How people behave when they think they're winning." Marcus leaned back. And it's very educational." He watched me for a moment. Then he said something that would later become very important. "Just be careful what you sign." I met his eyes. I always am. About 8 months later, Ethan officially filed for divorce. He did it on a Tuesday morning. Efficiency. He came home that evening, loosened his tie, and placed the envelope on the kitchen counter like it was a grocery receipt. "We should handle this cleanly," he said. I read the first page slowly. Irreconcilable differences. Standard language. "I agree," I said. He seemed relieved. No fight. No drama. Exactly what he wanted. But the next part came 2 weeks later, and that's when the humiliation started. Ethan hosted a company event at a downtown hotel. Investors, board members, press. I arrived early, wearing the navy dress he used to say was his favorite. Julia was already there, standing beside him, laughing at something he said. When Ethan noticed me, he smiled politely. "Claire?" he said. Julia turned. "Oh," she said brightly. "Hi." Then she added something that made several nearby investors glance over. "I didn't realize you were coming tonight." Ethan chuckled. Claire likes to stay involved. The word involved hung in the air like a small insult. One investor asked, "Claire's stepping back from operations, right?" Ethan nodded. "We're restructuring leadership." Julia smiled. And that's when I understood something important. They weren't just replacing me. They were rewriting history. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part happened during Ethan's speech later that night. He stood on stage with the confidence of a man who believed the future already belonged to him. "This company has grown because of vision," he said. "Because of leadership." He paused and looked toward Julia. "And because of people who understand where technology is going." Applause filled the room. Then someone shouted, "What about your co-founder?" Ethan smiled. "Claire helped a lot in the early days." Helped. In the early days. Like I was a summer intern. The room applauded again, and I stayed quiet. Because I already knew something they didn't. The divorce negotiations moved quickly after that. Ethan hired a very expensive lawyer, a man named Raymond Dillard who specialized in high-value marital asset division, which meant he was very good at making sure wealthy men kept their wealth. Our first negotiation meeting happened in a glass conference room overlooking the city. Raymond opened his folder. "Mr. Cole is prepared to offer a generous settlement." I waited. "The house will remain under Mr. Cole's ownership." "Of course," I said. Raymond blinked slightly. "The vacation property as well." "Understood." Ethan watched me carefully, waiting for resistance. Raymond continued. "The investment accounts will also remain with Mr. Cole." I nodded. "That's fine." The silence that followed was interesting. Raymond looked confused. Ethan looked suspicious. "You're not asking for anything?" Ethan said. "I'm asking for one thing." "What?" "The company stays operational." Ethan laughed softly. "That was always the plan." I smiled. "Good." What they didn't know was that 6 months earlier, during a quiet meeting in Marcus's office, I had asked a simple question. Who technically owns the platform infrastructure? Marcus pulled up the documents. "You do." Ethan owned the company. But the core software architecture license, the one required for the platform to operate legally, had been registered under my name years earlier when we were rushing through early filings. It had never been transferred. Marcus looked at me. You're not planning something reckless, are you? No, I said calmly. Just something fair. Back in the divorce conference room, Raymond closed his folder. Well, he said, this has been surprisingly straightforward. Ethan smiled. Claire's reasonable. I signed the agreement. And that's how my husband took everything. The house, the cars, the investments, the company. Every visible piece of our life. But 3 weeks later, during a quarterly board meeting, Ethan stood confidently at the head of the table. Julia sat beside him. The board members watched expectantly, and Ethan said the words he had rehearsed for weeks. Now that the divorce is finalized, he announced, we can move forward without distractions. Marcus cleared his throat. There's one issue we should address first. Ethan frowned. What issue? Marcus slid a document across the table. Ethan glanced down. Then his expression changed. Slowly. What is this? Marcus spoke calmly. The infrastructure license agreement. Julia leaned closer. What does that mean? Marcus looked at Ethan. It means the platform can't legally operate without Claire's authorization. The room went very quiet. Ethan stared at the document. That's impossible. Marcus shook his head. It's very possible. And that's when Ethan finally understood what he had taken in the divorce. Everything. Except the one thing that actually made it work. But the real surprise hadn't even happened yet. Because later that afternoon, Ethan called me, his voice tight. We need to talk. I answered calmly. I thought you took everything. There was a long pause. Claire, he said slowly, what exactly did I just inherit? And that was when things started to get interesting. When Ethan asked, what exactly did I just inherit? I didn't answer right away. Silence is a very useful tool. People rush to fill it. Claire? He said again, slower this time. Marcus mentioned something about a license. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window of my small office downtown. It was quiet there, intentionally quiet. I had moved into that office months earlier after stepping away from daily operations. Ethan used to joke that it looked more like a consulting studio than an executive office. Claire? Yes, Ethan. What license? The infrastructure license. What does that even mean? You should probably ask Marcus, I said calmly. Another pause. Then he lowered his voice. No, I'm asking you. I let a few seconds pass. The platform your company runs on, I said. The software architecture. The security layer. The core data engine. Yes, obviously. You remember when we registered it? That was years ago. Exactly. He was quiet again. Marcus said the license belongs to you. That's correct. And that means what exactly? It means the platform cannot legally operate without my authorization. The silence that followed was different. This one had weight. You're joking. No. That has to be some kind of technicality. It's a legal structure. You're telling me the entire company depends on a license I don't own? Yes. His voice hardened. Why would we ever structure it that way? Because when we filed the early intellectual property documents, you were still negotiating the investor terms. So we registered the architecture under the development entity, which was my name. He exhaled slowly. Claire. Yes? You signed the divorce agreement. I did. And you gave me the company. That's correct. Then the license should transfer automatically. No. Why not? Because the license isn't an asset of the company, I said gently. It's a licensing agreement between me and the company. He didn't respond. Not immediately. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different. You planned this. I shook my head, even though he couldn't see me. No. Then why didn't you mention it during negotiations? You didn't ask. He let out a sharp breath. That's unbelievable. At the time, I said quietly, I stayed quiet. Why? Because you said you wanted everything. Another silence. Then he asked the question I knew would come. What do you want? Nothing. That's not believable. I'm serious. Then fix the license. Fix it? Yes. Or transfer it. I could? And? I'm thinking about it. Claire? Yes? This is my company now. I smiled faintly. I know. You can't just hold it hostage. I'm not. Then what are you doing? I'm waiting. For what? For you to understand what actually happened. The next morning, Ethan called Marcus into his office. I know this because Marcus called me afterward. How did it go? I asked. Marcus chuckled quietly. He started with confidence. And that lasted about 3 minutes. I pictured the scene easily. Ethan sitting behind the glass desk in his corner office. Julia beside him. Marcus standing calmly across from them. What exactly did you tell him? I asked. Only the facts. Marcus had a talent for that. Which facts? That the platform license is owned by you. And that without it, the company cannot legally process data through the core system. And that the investors will want clarity. Marcus paused. He didn't enjoy that part. I imagine not. Julia asked if we could rebuild the architecture. I laughed softly. And? I told her it would take about 18 months and $40 million. Marcus paused again. And that's assuming we could replicate your original system. Which you can't. Correct. What did Ethan say? He asked if you were bluffing. And? I told him to read the contract. 2 days later, I received a formal email from Ethan's lawyer. Subject, license transfer discussion. I read it slowly, very professional, very polite. They requested a meeting to clarify licensing arrangements. I replied with one sentence. Of course. The meeting happened the following week. Same glass conference room where we finalized the divorce. Same lawyer, same polished table. Ethan arrived first. Julia came with him. Raymond Dillard sat across from me with a thick folder. Thank you for meeting, he said. Of course. Ethan watched me closely, like he was trying to read something hidden in my expression. Raymond opened his folder. As you know, Mr. Cole now holds full ownership of Coltech Solutions. Yes. However, it appears there is an infrastructure license currently registered under your name. That's correct. Raymond folded his hands. We believe this may have been an oversight. No. Ethan leaned forward. It was 15 years ago, Claire. Yes. That paperwork was temporary. No. Julia spoke for the first time. So the company literally can't operate without you? Not exactly. What do you mean? It can operate. For how long? About 3 weeks. Raymond blinked. Why 3 weeks? Because the license includes a rolling authorization protocol. And I haven't renewed it. Ethan stared at me. You're serious? Yes. Julia looked at Raymond. This is insane. Raymond kept his voice calm. Ms. Cole, he said, surely you understand the implications. I do. The company processes millions of transactions a day. I know. Disrupting that infrastructure would cause enormous financial damage. Yes. Ethan leaned forward. What do you want? I told you already. Don't say nothing. I want exactly what you wanted. What does that mean? I want everything to be fair. That's not an answer. I looked at him calmly. Isn't it? The room went quiet. Julia whispered. This is blackmail. No, I said. It's leverage. Ethan rubbed his forehead. Claire. Yes? Let's stop pretending this is some intellectual exercise. It's not. You're angry. No. You're punishing me. No. Then why are we here? Because you took everything. And? And I let you. His eyes narrowed. That sounds like a threat. No. It sounds like a warning. About what? About what you actually took. After that meeting, things became interesting. Ethan's confidence didn't disappear overnight. But it cracked. Small things started happening. Investors asked questions. The legal team reviewed documents. Julia started attending fewer meetings. Marcus kept sending me quiet updates. They're trying to restructure the architecture, he told me one evening. Good luck. They've hired 3 consultants. That's adorable. Marcus laughed. You're enjoying this? No. Yes, you are. I smiled into the phone. Maybe a little. But the truth was something else. I wasn't angry. I was curious. Curious how long it would take Ethan to realize something very important. Because the license agreement wasn't the real twist. It was just the first layer. And Ethan still hadn't discovered the second. Or the third. But he would. Soon. 2 weeks later, the company scheduled an emergency board meeting. Marcus called the night before. They're bringing you in. As what? The solution. I nodded slowly. Good. Claire? Yes? They're nervous. Of course they are. Marcus hesitated. Ethan looks tired. That happens when people start reading contracts. Marcus chuckled. You're ruthless. No. I leaned back in my chair. Just patient. And tomorrow, Ethan was finally going to understand exactly what he had taken in the divorce. But the best part? He still thought the license was the biggest problem. It wasn't. Not even close. The boardroom was already full when I arrived. That surprised me. Ethan had always been careful about optics. Meetings like this were usually controlled environments. Limited people, quiet discussions, carefully managed narratives. But that morning, the room held almost everyone who mattered. 6 board members, 2 major investors, the company's legal advisor, Marcus, Julia, and Ethan, standing at the far end of the long table like a man trying to hold together a story that was beginning to unravel. When the door opened and I stepped inside, conversation stopped. Not dramatically, just a subtle shift. Eyes turned, a few nods. Marcus gave me the smallest smile. Ethan didn't smile. Claire, he said. His voice sounded polite, controlled, but tired. Good morning. I walked to the empty seat halfway down the table. The same seat I used to occupy before I stepped away from daily operations. No one stopped me. That was interesting. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then Ethan cleared his throat. Thank you for coming. Of course. He glanced at the others. As everyone knows, we've encountered a licensing issue related to the platform infrastructure. One of the investors, a gray-haired man named Alan Pierce, folded his hands. We're aware. Ethan nodded. But it's temporary. No one responded. Julia leaned forward. We're working on a solution. Marcus spoke quietly. The solution is sitting at the table. Julia shot him a sharp look. Ethan ignored that. Instead, he looked at me. Claire holds the architecture license. Alan Pierce looked directly at me. Is that correct? Yes. And the company needs that license to continue operating? Yes. Another board member spoke. Why wasn't this addressed during the divorce settlement? Ethan answered quickly. It was an oversight. I didn't correct him. Not yet. Alan turned toward me again. Claire? Yes? Is this something you're willing to resolve? I'm open to discussion. That seemed to relax a few people. Ethan leaned forward. Good. His confidence flickered back for a moment. Then let's talk about transferring the license. Julia nodded. That would solve the issue immediately. I folded my hands on the table. It would solve one issue. Ethan's expression tightened slightly. What does that mean? It means the license is only part of the infrastructure. The room went quiet. Marcus leaned back in his chair. He had the look of someone who had already watched this movie once. Ethan frowned. What other infrastructure? I looked around the room slowly. Then I said something that made 3 board members sit up straighter. The security architecture. Julia blinked. What security architecture? The encryption framework. Ethan's voice sharpened. That's part of the platform. No. Marcus spoke quietly. It's a separate structure. Ethan turned toward him. You knew about this? Marcus shrugged slightly. I read the contracts. Alan Pierce leaned forward. Claire, are you saying the encryption system is also licensed? Yes. And owned by you? Yes. Julia shook her head. That's impossible. Why? Because the company built it. No, I said gently. I built it. The room was silent again. Ethan stared at me. How? During year 3. That's when we expanded the security layer. Yes. And the intellectual property registration? I tilted my head slightly. You were negotiating investor terms. Marcus chuckled quietly. That week was chaos. Julia looked between us. So you're telling me... She stopped. Then she said it again. You're telling me Claire owns both the platform architecture and the encryption system? Marcus nodded. Correct. Alan Pierce leaned back in his chair. Well, he said slowly, that's significant. Ethan's voice was tight. Why didn't anyone notice this before? Marcus answered calmly. Because nobody was looking. Julia looked at Ethan. This can't be right. Ethan didn't answer. He was staring at the documents Marcus had slid across the table. Reading, then reading again. And that was when something in his expression shifted. The first real crack. This means, he said quietly. Marcus finished the sentence. It means the company doesn't legally control its core technology. Alan Pierce exhaled slowly. Well, another board member spoke. Claire, why structure it that way? I met his eyes. Because when we started the company, we were protecting the architecture from early investors. That's true, Marcus said. We kept the core technology separate until the company stabilized. And it never got transferred? Alan asked. Marcus shrugged. No one pushed for it. Everyone looked at Ethan. He didn't look up. Julia whispered, we can still rebuild. Marcus shook his head. Not quickly. How long? At least 18 months. And the cost? Marcus gave a small smile. More than the company's current liquidity. Julia leaned back. This is a disaster. No, Alan Pierce said calmly. This is leverage. The word hung in the room. Leverage. Ethan finally looked up. Claire. Yes? What exactly do you want? I already told you. That answer isn't working anymore. Which answer? That you want things to be fair. I tilted my head. And? And fairness isn't a legal term. No, I said quietly. It's a balance. Julia scoffed. This is ridiculous. Alan Pierce looked at her. No, he said. It's actually quite elegant. She stared at him. What do you mean? He gestured toward me. Claire built the technology. He gestured toward Ethan. Ethan owns the company. Then he folded his hands. And neither one works without the other. Marcus nodded. That's the current situation. Ethan leaned forward. Claire? Yes? Let's stop circling around this. Okay, what do you want? This time I answered clearly. I want what I built. You signed that away. No, I signed away the company. Ethan stared at me. You're splitting hairs. No, I leaned forward slightly. I'm separating structures. Julia whispered, This is insane. Alan Pierce ignored her. What exactly are you proposing? He asked me. A partnership. Ethan laughed. You've got to be kidding. No. You think after everything that happened, we're going to run the company together? No. His eyes narrowed. Then what kind of partnership? The kind where the technology company licenses its infrastructure from my firm? The room went quiet again. Marcus smiled faintly. Claire Tech Holdings, he said. Julia looked confused. What is that? I answered calmly. The development company I formed 8 months ago. Ethan's head snapped up. You formed another company? Yes. When? Last year. Marcus nodded. That's where the license agreements are registered. Alan Pierce leaned back in his chair. Well, he said softly. Now this is getting interesting. Julia looked at Ethan. Did you know about this? No. Ethan looked at me. You created a second company. Yes. And transferred the technology there. Yes. And now you want my company to pay you? Yes. How much? 8% of platform revenue? Julia almost laughed. 8%? Marcus nodded. That's actually very reasonable. Ethan slammed his hand lightly on the table. This is unbelievable. I stayed calm. You took everything in the divorce. That doesn't give you the right to cripple the company. I'm not crippling it. Then what are you doing? I'm restructuring it. Alan Pierce spoke quietly. And frankly, Ethan, it's a smart structure. Julia turned toward him. You're siding with her? I'm siding with sustainability. He looked at Ethan. The company needs the infrastructure. Then he looked at me. And Claire built it. Marcus added gently, This arrangement actually protects both sides. Ethan rubbed his forehead. This is absurd. Julia whispered, She planned this. I shook my head. No. Then I looked directly at Ethan. You planned it. What does that mean? You wanted everything. And I got it. Yes. I leaned back slightly. You just didn't realize what came with it. The room was silent again. Ethan looked around the table. No one was smiling. No one was laughing. The situation had shifted. And for the first time since the divorce began, Ethan understood something very clearly. The company he thought he owned completely didn't actually belong to him alone anymore. But the truth was even more complicated than that, because there was still one final detail he hadn't discovered yet, and that detail was waiting quietly inside a document Marcus hadn't opened. Yet. Marcus had been quiet for most of the meeting. Not silent, just careful. Observing the way he always did when numbers, contracts and human ego started colliding in the same room. But now he reached into the leather folder in front of him. Ethan noticed immediately. What is that? He asked. Marcus didn't answer right away. He pulled out a thin document, much thinner than the licensing agreements, and placed it gently on the table. I think, Marcus said calmly, we should review the development agreement as well. Ethan frowned. What development agreement? The one we signed during year 4. Julia looked confused. What year 4 agreement? Marcus slid the paper across the table toward Ethan. The one that governed the architecture build-out? Ethan barely glanced at it. We've already discussed the architecture. Marcus shook his head slightly. No, we discussed the license. Then he tapped the document. This is the development agreement. Alan Pierce leaned forward again. He had been following every moment with quiet fascination. Go on, he said. Marcus opened the document and turned it so the table could see the relevant section. This agreement defines who funded and directed the early infrastructure work. Ethan rubbed his temple. Marcus, we all know the company funded it. Marcus met his eyes. Not exactly. The room stilled. Julia leaned closer. What does that mean? Marcus turned the document toward Ethan again. During year 4, he said calmly, the company ran into a liquidity problem. That was true. The early years had been brutal. Growth was explosive, but cash flow lagged behind. We had been surviving on investor commitments and careful budgeting. What does that have to do with anything? Ethan asked. Marcus continued. At the time, Claire personally funded the development of the security architecture. Ethan blinked. What? Julia looked confused. That doesn't sound right. Marcus flipped another page. The company didn't have enough capital to complete the encryption layer. Claire funded the project privately. Alan Pierce raised an eyebrow. How much? Marcus answered calmly. $3.8 million. Julia stared at me. You invested almost $4 million into the infrastructure? I nodded. Yes. Ethan looked at Marcus. That was a temporary bridge loan. Marcus shook his head. No. Then he pointed to the clause halfway down the page. It was an equity-linked development investment. Ethan leaned forward and grabbed the document. What does that mean? Marcus folded his hands. It means Claire funded the technology in exchange for a revenue-linked participation agreement. The room was silent. Alan Pierce spoke first. How much participation? Marcus answered evenly. 12% of net platform revenue. Julia's eyes widened. 12%? Marcus nodded. For the lifetime of the architecture. Ethan stared at the page. Then he looked at me. You never collected that? No. Why not? Because we were married. That answer hung in the air for a long moment. Marcus continued quietly. The participation agreement was paused under a spousal partnership clause. Julia frowned. What does that mean? Marcus pointed to another line. It means the revenue share remained dormant as long as Claire and Ethan were married. Alan Pierce leaned back slowly. And after the divorce? Marcus closed the folder. The clause activates. Ethan went completely still. Julia whispered, Wait. Then she looked at Marcus. You're telling me the company now owes Claire 12% of revenue? Marcus nodded. In addition to the infrastructure license. The room felt different now. Heavier. Realization spreading slowly across the table. Alan Pierce let out a low whistle. Well, Julia looked at Ethan. You didn't know about this? Ethan didn't answer. He was still staring at the contract, reading the clause again and again. Finally, he looked up. How much is that worth? Marcus didn't hesitate. Based on current projections? Yes. Marcus glanced at the financial sheet in front of him. Approximately $26 million per year. The room went very quiet. Julia whispered, That's impossible. Marcus shook his head. No. Ethan leaned back slowly. You're telling me my company now owes Claire $26 million a year. Marcus corrected him gently. The company you acquired in the divorce. Ethan looked at me again. You knew about this? Yes. And you said nothing. You didn't ask. Julia shook her head. This is unbelievable. I met Ethan's eyes calmly. You said you wanted everything. His voice was lower now. You let me take it. Yes. Why? I considered the question for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Because I wanted you to have exactly what you asked for. Alan Pierce chuckled quietly. I have to admit, that's impressive. Julia looked at him like he'd lost his mind. This is a disaster. No, Alan said. This is business. Marcus added calmly. And technically, it's a very clean structure. Ethan rubbed his face slowly. You set this up years ago. No. You're telling me all of this just happened? Yes. Then I added something he hadn't considered. But you created the conditions for it. How? You stopped paying attention. The boardroom stayed silent, because everyone there understood something Ethan had just realized. The contracts had always been there. The structure had always existed. But for years, no one had looked closely enough to notice. And when Ethan pushed me out of the company, he removed the one person who had been quietly holding those structures together. Now they had snapped back into place. Julia leaned toward him. We can fight this. Marcus shook his head. The contracts are airtight. Julia looked at Ethan again, then renegotiate. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at me for a long time. Then he asked quietly, What do you want now? Nothing. That's not believable. I'm serious. Then why are we even having this conversation? I smiled faintly. Because you called the meeting. Alan Pierce nodded. That's true. The room relaxed slightly. The tension had shifted. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. Ethan finally leaned forward again. If we restructure the revenue share? Marcus raised a hand. That would require Claire's approval. Ethan looked at me. Would you consider it? I thought for a moment. Then I said something that surprised even Marcus. No. Julia stared. You're serious? Yes. Ethan frowned. Why? Because the structure works. For you. For the company, too. Marcus nodded slowly. She's right. Julia looked confused. How? Marcus explained. The infrastructure stays stable. The technology remains protected. The company keeps operating. Alan Pierce added, and Claire becomes the quiet partner who built the foundation. He smiled slightly. Frankly, I like it. Julia leaned back in frustration. This is insane. But Ethan didn't argue anymore, because he understood something now. The fight was over, and the outcome had been written years earlier in documents he had never bothered to read. After a long moment, he closed the folder. Well, he said quietly, I guess I did take everything in the divorce. I met his eyes. Yes. And everything includes the obligations. Yes. He let out a slow breath. Then something unexpected happened. He laughed. Not bitterly. Just tired. Claire, he said. Yes? You always were the smartest person in the room. I shook my head. No. Then what were you? I stood up from the table. The one paying attention. Marcus smiled faintly. Alan Pierce nodded with quiet respect. Julia looked like she was still trying to understand how the story had turned upside down. Ethan watched me walk toward the door. Claire. I paused. Yes? He hesitated for a moment. Then he said the only honest thing left. I underestimated you. I thought about that. Then I answered softly, No. You underestimated the work. The door closed behind me as I left the boardroom. Outside, the afternoon sun reflected off the glass towers across the street. For the first time in years, the world felt quiet. Not triumphant, not dramatic, just balanced. Ethan had taken everything. The house, the company, the assets, the life we built together. But the truth is, he had also taken the responsibility for the foundation underneath it. And sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't destroying what someone built. Sometimes it's simply letting them keep it. Exactly the way they demanded. Every piece of it. Including the parts they never understood. And that, it turned out, was more than enough.